4 o'clock. Okay, so here we go. So first of all, welcome everybody. Sorry for last week. I thought that it would be better to give a shiur that's fresh than a shiur that I wasn't prepared to give. Okay, so we're going to look at at the 33rd mitzvah in the Torah, which is the mitzvah of the Cohanim to wear special clothing when they are when they're doing the avodah, when they're doing the service in the Beis HaMikdash. So I'm going to assume everybody, even though I only gave you a day, I'm going to assume everybody saw the introductory shiur. So we'll go a little quicker through the sources and get to the questions. So the first thing is you have the psukim. The psukim talk about the fact that the Cohen has to wear special clothing. And the psukim, just interesting to note, if you look here at get the sources up here. So if you look like right at the end of this line here, it says that it's chukas olam, that this is a command for the generations. And this isn't just something that Aaron had to do at the time of the Mishkan, but all Kohanim have to always be wearing their special clothing while they do the avodah. Okay, so that's the mitzvah.
Is there a avodah that was done not in the Beit HaMikdash, that you were able to bring a korban in a different place and maybe bring it to the?
Once the Beis HaMikdash is built, then it becomes an issa d'oraisa to give a korban anywhere else. Before the Beis HaMikdash was built, when there was a Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael, there was like 500 years where there was a Mishkan. So then there was then you were allowed to give a korban closer to your house. But once the Beis HaMikdash was built, then it became forbidden to give a korban anywhere else.
You couldn't shecht it, I don't know, in Mitzpeh Yericho and then bring it to be burnt on the Mizbeach.
I don't think so. I'm not exactly sure about. No, I think everything has to be done in the Mikdash.
Beis HaMikdash. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So so that became the that's the thing. Okay. So now that's the psukim. Then you have the Sefer Mitzvos. Okay. So the Sefer Mitzvos. This is very, very interesting. This Rambam's in the Sefer Mitzvos because first of all, it's very lengthy for something for a mitzvah that I would think didn't need that much writing about. So in the beginning, it makes sense that the Rambam talks about that you have to have special clothing, but he quotes the fact that it's miyuchadim l'chavod tifaret, right? So that it's for honor and for beauty. So that's a direct quote from the psukim, 100%, but that seems to be more philosophical. In other words, it's very easy to explain this mitzvah and go ahead and say the following: say that the clothing make the man. Right, so he has to put on special clothing. There's an idea the Rambam talks about when he talks about the Beis HaMikdash. So he talks about the mitzvah of Yuras HaMikdash and Chavod HaMikdash. There's a mitzvah to have all of the Beis HaMikdash, and there's a philosophical idea that's like the underlying current to many mitzvahs that we have in the Beis HaMikdash, which is that it has to strike a sense of awe in a person. A person has to look at the Beis HaMikdash as a unique place. And so therefore, we're not supposed to go to the Beis HaMikdash that often. That's the Rambam's idea behind Tuma and Tahara. The whole idea that a Tameh person is Tameh isn't a spiritual idea, but it's a whole idea to distance themselves from the Beis HaMikdash. You have to be more vigilant before you go to the Beis HaMikdash if you want to stay Tahar. So that's like this whole idea. The Beis HaMikdash has to be beautiful so that when people see it, they say, wow, look at this building. Amazing. So that's a very easy thing. And then you see the clothing lends to that same idea. That's a perfect explanation for this mitzvah, but it's a philosophical explanation. It's not a halachic explanation, which is strange then because the Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvos doesn't usually have usually philosophical ideas. But this mitzvah, when the Rambam talks about this mitzvah, it's full of philosophy. He says, "Lovosh begadim yuchadim l'chavod sifares." He wears them for honor and for beauty. Okay, that's great. That again, there's nothing wrong with that idea, but it's a philosophical idea. So why is the Rambam throwing philosophy here into the Sefer Mitzvos? And then later on in the Sefer Mitzvos, this whole entire paragraph, this last paragraph of the Sefer Mitzvos, where he talks about that, how do you know that that the Cohen has to wear this clothing not for his own grandeur or not even so that he looks great, but rather he's doing it because it's a mitzvah of Hashem. In other words, he can't even think to himself, I have to look good because I'm going to be in the Beis HaMikdash. That can't even be his intention. His intention has to be, this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, and that's why I'm doing it. Okay, interesting idea, not halachic in nature at all. Also, just strange that that's the mitzvah in the first place. In other words, we don't have that by other mitzvahs. That a person's kavana has to be, his intention has to be that he's trying to fulfill the decree of the king, not for the specific philosophical idea. It doesn't say that the Cohen can't look at as a Musar idea. You could say, okay, the Cohen shouldn't think to himself, I'm gonna look perfect here, and I want to look great, right? That's okay. Okay, that's a great Musar idea. That's not even what the Rambam is quoting from the Medrash. What the Rambam is quoting here from the Sifra is that the Cohen can't think to himself, I have to make sure that I look good. That's not that right, because that seems to be the Chavod Sifaris. That seems to be what he's trying to accomplish. But that's not even what he's saying here. He's saying that the Cohen has to think to himself when he's putting on these clothing, why am I wearing these clothing? Because the king, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said I should wear these clothing. It's almost like turning it very superficial, right? Okay, so what do we have? We have like these Musar ideas that you see in Chazal when a person gives a shiur. So they shouldn't give a shiur, and they shouldn't think to themselves, okay, well, I'm giving this shiur for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's honor and not for myself so that I look good. Okay, nice. That's nice. It's a great Musar idea. But guess what? If a guy gives a shiur because he wants to look good, he's still giving a great shiur, and he's still fulfilling the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and there's nothing wrong, right? Here, the Rambam's putting into the Sefer Mitzvos, which is a book that talks about the nature of the mitzvah. It doesn't talk about the philosophy behind the mitzvah. It talks about the halachic nature of the mitzvah, and he throws this in. So that's very, very strange. So I bring that in because the Rambam starts off with philosophy, and he ends with I'm going to obviously show it's not philosophy, but he seems to start off and end with philosophical ideas about this mitzvah, which again, great for the Moreh Nevuchim, great for different parts of the Mishnah Torah, but the Sefer Mitzvos is not what he does. So the direction you have to take is, okay, it seems philosophical, but what's the halachic idea behind here, right? And if you say, okay, hold on a second, we seem to always like be running this line between philosophy and halacha. So what's the difference between the two? So when it comes to philosophy, you're answering the question as to why you're doing it. When you're answering the question halachically, you're asking yourself, what's the halachic objective here? What are we trying to accomplish halachically here? What's the halachic kiyum of the mitzvah? What have I fulfilled the mitzvah? That's what we're trying to accomplish here. That's what we're trying to figure out. So somehow the idea of l'chavod sifaris, that the clothing lends to honor and beauty, right? And this idea that we have that wearing clothing, the Cohen should wear them for the idea that it's the Gzeras HaMelech, that's the decree of God, and not for the fact that it makes him look good, or even if he's looking good in order to make the Beis HaMikdash look good. So those type of things, those have to lend to the halachic objective, not to the philosophy. So that's our question: is how does that lend to the halachic objective here? Okay.
We do have mitzvahs that require kavana.
Yeah, we do have mitzvahs that require kavana, 100%.
And if you have the wrong kavana, you won't be yotzei.
But that's kavana in terms of, yeah, that's true. But here, it doesn't seem like it seems like the idea behind the kavana, like for instance, the kavana that I won't be yotzei isn't philosophical ideas. It's sometimes maybe you could make an argument that sukkah it seems like a philosophical idea when it comes to you have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. But like when it comes to the avodah and the mikdash, the kavana that we're usually talking about that lends itself, let's say, to pigul or something of that nature, is when I'm eschaving to the wrong korban. I think I'm giving a chatas and I'm really giving a shlamim. So then I'm not yotzei because I have the wrong korban in mind. The opinion that holds that mitzvah strichas kavana doesn't mean I have to be thinking about a certain thing when I'm doing the mitzvah. It just I have to be thinking that I'm doing the mitzvah, right? That I'm aware that I'm doing a mitzvah now. So that's usually what kavana is. Not kavana, I shouldn't think this, right? When I'm doing the kavana, I should be doing that. I should be thinking this. That's what this formulation is. That's very odd. Okay. So my first question is like this: is we have this mitzvah, the Cohen has to wear clothing. If he doesn't wear the clothing, or he doesn't wear enough clothing, when he's doing the avodah. So then the avodah is posul. Okay, so you have to ask yourself the question as follows: what about the clothing? Again, not why, but what about the clothing makes it that the avodah is posul if I don't wear the clothing? Okay, so let me explain what that means. In other words, I understand if we just gave the example, let's say, of mischaving to the wrong korban when I'm giving the korban. Okay, so therefore I could say very simple. In order to fulfill my chiyuv of doing the korban properly, right? In order for the korban to be kosher, I have to be thinking of the right korban. Okay, so a qualifying factor for some reason is I have to have in mind the right korban. That makes sense because it's a din in the korban. But here it's very strange. We're saying that there's something about the avodah that would be lacking if the Cohen wasn't wearing the proper clothing. So that the question you have to ask is, what about the avodah would be lacking if the Cohen isn't wearing the proper clothing? Now you have to ask. Right? So there's something about the avodas hamikdash that requires the clothing. That's the question. Okay.
Is that like saying when I wear tefillin, if I don't have the 4 parshios in my tefillin, there's something lacking in my mitzvah?
There's something lacking in the tefillin. No, so there you say there's something lacking in the tefillin. What makes tefillin are 4 parshios. So if I have 3 parshios, I don't have tefillin.
What makes the korban is the Cohen wearing the clothing.
Okay, so how does that make a
partial of the mitzvah?
I'm saying that it's clear that's what it is, but what about the korban requires tefillin? I understand tefillin is I have to have tefillin which has 4 parshios in it because the 4 parshios lend to what I'm supposed to be remembering when I have tefillin. So I understand the direct connection. But a korban is an animal. The Cohen is the Cohen, right? So what about the Kohanim's clothing has anything to do with a korban?
Well, why can't I say the same thing about other mitzvahs like the tefillin that require parshios? I can put the straps and the box on my head, and I have tefillin. No, the Torah says your tefillin has to have 4 parshios.
Right. Okay, so
your korban needs the clothing of the Cohen.
Okay, so what about the korban requires clothing? I understand that it does. I'm asking what about the korban requires the Cohen to wear clothing? I'm not arguing that it doesn't. I'm asking what about it that does require. That's what I'm asking. I'm not saying that the halach is wrong. I'm not saying that the pasuk is wrong and that you should.
And that's not a philosophical question.
No, because then they'd be asking why, right? I'm asking there's a factor in the avodah, in the avodas hamikdash that requires the Cohen to be wearing clothing. So I'm saying I don't get it because what about a korban, right? I have an animal. I'm giving the animal. Okay, so the animal has to have certain requirements, right? Okay, but why does the Cohen have to be wearing certain clothing? What about the Cohen wearing certain clothing? It has anything to do with the korban? That's the question. Okay. Then the third question was this idea. Well, the second question is, it's not only that the avodah becomes posul, but the korban, the Cohen is now chayiv mitzvah. Okay, so I understand. I think about the wrong korban. Okay, so the korban doesn't count. It's posul. I get that. Fine. Okay, that's a din in the korban. So if we see there's a din in the korban, so the korban becomes posul. That I understand. That makes a lot of sense to me. But now we're going a step further. Now we're saying that not only does the korban become posul, but the Cohen is chayiv mitzvah. Why all of a sudden it's sort of like a lahavdil if you look at like there's civil law and criminal law, right? So if I do something wrong, right? So if I injure somebody else, so then that's a civil offense, right? So the person can sue me. Okay. So here in halacha, you could say when it comes to the avodah, there's a sort of like a civil, like the analogy would be, I don't know what it would be, but it would be sort of like there's something that qualifies the korban and something that doesn't qualify the korban. Okay, so that's a din in the korban. So then I understand whether the korban is posul or the korban is kosher, right? That I get. But that's not criminal. Here, all of a sudden, we're taking it to another step. Now it's sort of like the Cohen is violating a sin where the Cohen himself now becomes chayiv mitzvah. If I offer a korban that, let's say, has a blemish, I'm not Chayav Misa, right? I'm not doing anything criminally wrong. All of a sudden here, there's something criminally wrong here, right? So that takes it, that's like a whole other step. So we have to ask about that. How does that work that the person's Chayav Misa? That tells us that there's something going on here more than just what makes avodah kosher and posul. Okay. And then again, the question that we started with, this whole idea of like, the Kehuna of the Cohen and what he's wearing and why that matters. Okay. We have the Gemaras here. Okay. So the Gemara, there's a couple of Gemaras here. I only brought down the Gemara in Zvachim, and the Gemara talks about, the Mishnah talks about things that apostle the avodah, and it talks about the last line here on the Mishnah, chusar begadim, right, where you're not wearing enough clothing. So the Gemara says, chusar begadim minol. Where do we get this from? Right. So okay, a whole brings down the pasuk that we saw in the Rambam, right? Kehuna chukas olam. Right, and then the Gemara says something very interesting, right? And this is obviously blows up the whole sugya. This tells us everything, and this is a fascinating idea, right? Because we would say, what makes a Cohen a Cohen? What makes a Cohen is his lineage. His father is a Cohen, right? You know, famous jokes, right? Father's a Cohen, grandfather's a Cohen, you're a Cohen, right? That's it. That's all it takes. Here, though, it says, "Bizman shebigdehem alehem kuhunasam alehem." When the Cohen's clothes are on him, he's a Cohen. When the begadim are not on him, he's not a Cohen. Right, that's very strange, right? What does that mean that he's not a Cohen because his clothing aren't on him? Okay, that's very odd. And then the Gemara comes along and has a Gzera Shava, right? So first of all, we have to ask the question: what does that mean that he's not a Cohen, right? When his clothing aren't on him, and then you have a Gzera Shava. So I talked about this a little in the introductory shiur, but I wanna really spend a little bit of time explaining how to learn a Gzera Shava, okay? Because Gzera Shava, a lot of times we look at Gzera Shava on a methodological level, and it seems like to be one of these like hocus pocus tricks that Chazal knew how to do, and we don't know how to do it anymore. So it's true that we're not allowed to make Gzera Shavas. When we look at I notice that there's two words in the same pasuk, so I can't go ahead and say, oh, I'm going to come up with a halacha. There's something similar to them because it uses the same word. I'm not allowed to do that. That I can't do, right? Chazal, we're allowed to do that. I can't do that. But that doesn't mean that just because I can't do it anymore, right, and that we haven't been allowed to create Gzera Shava since the time of the Gemara, that doesn't mean we can't understand what goes into a Gzera Shava, okay? That's important. So listen to this idea, okay? When it comes to a Gzera Shava, what the Gemara is doing is it's saying, okay, look, it uses the same word in two different psukim, right? So you say, oh, okay, and there's a halacha that's true of pasuk A. So therefore, in pasuk B, we can use that same. We notice the same word. So therefore, we say there's the same halacha. In our case, what are we referring to? In our case, somebody that's a Cohen that does the avodah when he's intoxicated. So that Cohen is Chayav Misa, okay, and it uses the word chukah. So the Gemara notices, it uses the word chukah here by mechusar begadim, by a Cohen that doesn't wear begadim, but enough clothing also, or the proper clothing. So therefore, he's also chayav misa because it says chukah. Okay, right? That's where we that's the Gzera Shava limud. So you could say, okay, there's a hocus pocus idea going on here. Same word teaches us the same thing. Chazal knew when it applies, when it doesn't apply, and that's all we could do is just simply say it's a Gzera Shava. I think that's how most people learn. I think that most people say they stop analyzing at that point. They stop saying, they say, look, the Chazal knew how to do this. We don't know how to do this. This is something that's Gzera Shava. We just know when you see the same word. So there's a connection between the two, and that's all we have. But that's not true. Okay, that's not true. That's not the only thing that we can figure out. There has to be a way. There has to be a connection on a conceptual level between the two psukim. It can't be so simple as it's just two words that are similar in the psukim, and therefore we're able to transfer one halacha to the other. That can't be it. What Chazal are telling us when they say that there's a Gzera Shava is they're saying there's something similar between these two psukim, between these two mitzoles, between these two halachos, whatever it is, there's something similar between them. And therefore, since they're conceptually connected, halachically, they're going to be connected as well. So as the learner, what your responsibility to do is to say, okay, if the halacha transfers, there has to be a connection that a conceptual connection that transfers them, right? That's what lumdus is. What we're doing in these shiurim is we're looking at lumdus. We're looking at the methodology of analysis of Torah, right, of halachas in specific. So what we have to be able to do is we have to be able to sit there and say, okay, what is the conceptual connection? What is that connection? That's what we're trying to figure out. We're looking at the components of each halacha. So here we're saying there must be a component to this one halacha about being inebriated that's the same component is found when it comes to the idea of a Cohen not wearing proper clothing. How do I know that that's true? How do I know that there's a connection? There's a gzera shava. Chazal tell us there's a gzera shava there. Chazal tell us that there is a connection between the two, and the symptoms, or the consequence of that connection is the fact that that the same halacha applies, meaning that the Cohen is chayav misa in both cases of being inebriated and when he serves without proper clothing on. So our job, what we have to figure out is,
in your methodology,
what is the conceptual connection?
In your methodology, is this connection allowed to be philosophical or darshan?
No, that's the whole point. The whole point is if it's going to translate legally, it has to be a legal It has to be a legal concept. There has to be a legal concept for the legality to transfer, or else I wouldn't be able to analyze it, because then I would never know where it ends, right? That's the idea. Okay. Then we have the Rambam. So the first halacha in the Rambam, it just says basically the same thing. We don't have to read it again. There's nothing new that we haven't seen in the Gemara and the Sefer Mitzvos. But this second halacha is interesting. The Rambam talks about in the Sefer Mitzvos for 1 second, but doesn't really go into it. But this is fascinating because, and I'll tell you where my question comes from. I understand that a Cohen, I don't understand it fully yet, but I do get that. I'm holding of the fact that a Cohen, in order to serve, has to have clothing on, right? The specific clothing he has to have, and there's a certain number of clothing he has to have, and a specific amount of garments that he has to have. Okay, so then what I would think to say is, once he has those garments, right? Once he's wearing those garments, then he's good to go, right? Then he's good to go. The fact that he puts on 2 of them, right? That doesn't seem to be a problem, because he's already wearing the clothing, right? That says that the avodah is kosher. He was told to put on the clothing. He put the clothing on. The fact that he put 2 of the clothing on, why is that a problem? Right? Why should that be an issue? No, so then it would be an issue batosif. Fine. If you want to say batosif, you can say batosif. That's fine. But then it's batosif. That's not usher. That's not making it now that he should be chayiv misa. You're not chayiv misa for batosif. Batosif shouldn't posul the avodah, right? So you could say, if you say batosif, that's great. But the Rambam, number 1, the Rambam doesn't say batosif. And number 2, it's chayav misa, which tells me that's not batosif. It tells me it's that it's hainu hach. He missed the halacha. He negated this mitzvah, and the negation, the not doing of this mitzvah and doing the avodah incurs a penalty of being chayav misa. And that's exactly what happens. Chayav misa b'dei shemayim, he says, right? So having too many clothing, right, is just as serious of an offense as not wearing the clothing at all. That seems to go against the halacha, right? Or it seems to be at least inconsistent with how our understanding of the halacha, that in order to be kosher, in order for the avodah to be kosher, and obviously for you to avoid being chayav misa b'dei shemayim, you have to be wearing the clothing. You are wearing the clothing, right? So that doesn't seem to be an issue. So, and yet here he says it is. So that's our question in the Rambam. Okay. It's not so much a question on the Rambam. It's a question on the halacha itself. That's not the sheet of the Rambam. That's everybody. Okay. We talked about the fact that the Sefer Mitzvos was written almost as a polemic. It wasn't really written as a polemic, but it was written against. The Rambam saw an issue where so many people had made mistakes. So many of the Gonim had made mistakes counting the 613 mitzvos. He felt the need to write a book about what the 613 mitzvos actually were. An extension of that book of what the 613 mitzvos were was then a book of all the halachos, which was the Mishnah Torah. Okay, the Sefer Mitzvos and the Mishnah Torah are 2 separate works, but the Ramban came along to defend the Behag, mostly the Bahalachas Gadol. So the Rambam had written against. So here, this is a classic example of where the Ramban's notes, Hasagos Ramban on the Sefer Mitzvos, is where the Ramban comes to show how the Behag and the Rambam disagreed, and how the Behag was correct, or at least how the Behag's svara in it. So here he says like this. He says we start at the end. Raisi the Bahal Achos the Bahal Achos is the Behag Shimna Osam Aval Mana Belavim Mechusa Begadim Shishime. So the Behag understood this halacha as an isser. You're not allowed to serve without the amount of clothing. The Rambam saw it otherwise, right? The Rambam saw this as a mitzvah asay. This was a command that you have to do. The Behag said this is something that you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to serve without clothing. The Daita Zoslo Mar that came on to Ein Belvishus Begadim Shlo B'Shas Avoda Shu Mitzvah Eina Ela Hechsher HaAvoda Shim Ava B'Pachos Man Obeyoser Tifsa Avoda. So how did the Behag understand this mitzvah? He had a different understanding that we've been saying so far. The Behag starts off by saying this cannot be a mitzvah asay. This can't be a mitzvah of something you have to do. Rather, why not? Because it's clear that this whole mitzvah is a hechsher avodah. What does that mean? It means that in order we know what a hechsher mitzvah is. That in order to do certain mitzvahs, there are actions that I have to do, but those actions themselves lend to the mitzvah, to the fulfillment of the mitzvah, but they themselves aren't the mitzvah, right? So, for instance, building my sukkah. Right, building my sukkah is a hechsher mitzvah. There's no mitzvah to build a sukkah. There's a mitzvah to live in the sukkah. I can't live in the sukkah unless I build a sukkah. So therefore, building a sukkah is a hechsher mitzvah. It allows me to fulfill the mitzvah of living in the sukkah. My nafkamina between a hechsher mitzvah and a mitzvah itself. So that I don't make a bracha on a hechsher mitzvah, right? So when I do a mitzvah, then I do make a bracha. Okay, fine. So here it says the Behag. There's an idea of hechsher avodah. There's certain things I have to do in order to make the avodah kosher. It itself is not a mitzvah, but it's a qualification for the avodah itself. So here the Behag says this isn't the mitzvah for the Cohen to be wearing proper clothing. All it is hechsher avodah. It just means that I have to be wearing, the Cohen has to be wearing the proper amount of clothing. If he doesn't wear the proper amount of clothing, then the avodah is posul, which is how we understood it. My question on the Behag would then be, I know the Behag's answer, but my question on the Behag would be, so then why are you chayiv misa for just not fulfilling a hechsher avodah? And the Behag has a perfect answer. What does he say? There's a lav. So the Behag is very good. He covers himself. He says, no, one of the prohibitions of the Torah is to not wear the Cohens, not wear the clothing when doing the avodah. So therefore, if I don't have the clothing on, then the avodah is posul. Why? Because I didn't do the proper hechsher, I didn't do the proper preparation. And why am I chayiv misa? Because I violated a lav, right? So, and the lav is I'm chayiv misa for, right? So the Behag has it clear. It's a very clear cut to the Behag. Had the Behag not said that there was a lav, then the Behag wouldn't make too much sense. So our question here is, and this is our last question, is what's the machlokes between the Behag and the Rambam about whether or not the wearing of the clothing is a mitzvah asay or it's a mitzvah los asay. Okay, and the Behag would tell you that this is just a hechsher avodah. So what would the Rambam say? It seems like it is a hechsher avodah. It's a perfectly logical opinion of the Behag. This isn't a hard opinion of the Behag to explain. It seems very clear. So how would the Rambam understand this as not a hechsher avodah? Okay, good. Okay, so those are our questions. Okay, so let's have. So I don't think the svara here is too difficult to understand. Okay, I don't think the svara here about the Cohanim is too hard. The big day Kehuna is too hard to understand. I think the idea is as follows: the clothing that the Cohen wears qualifies. Now here's the key difference. It qualifies not the avodah, but it qualifies the Cohen. It's not a din in the avodah, it's a din in the Cohen himself. Okay, and so we'll explain this, but I think that's the svara that behind the nature of the big day Kehuna. We might have thought the entire time, and I think it's how we set this up, and this is what led to most of our questions, is we couldn't understand the relationship between the clothing and the avodah, the clothing and the service itself, right? Why would it posul the service? Why would you chayiv misa for the service? Right? It doesn't seem to make too much sense. Okay, and where's the criminal act here? Right? Why is there a punishment? So now, if we understand that it qualifies the Cohain to serve, okay, and what do I mean by that? There's a mitzvah. Maybe one day we'll see it. the haramas hadeshen, right? I think it's like actually the mitzvah that comes before this. I think it's the 32nd mitzvah or maybe 31st mitzvah. Haramas hadeshen me'al mizbeach. Every day, the start of the Beis Hamikdash, of the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, early in the morning, even before Hanetz, before the korban tamid was given, there would be korbanos burning the whole entire night. The innards of the animals were burning the entire night on the mizbeach. By the time the morning came around, so the mizbeach would be filthy with ashes. So the Cohen would start off the day by going up and cleaning off the ashes, right? So, and the Rambam says there's a special mitzvah, big day Kehuna, shetorim behem hadeshen, yu pchusin mina bagadim shishimish behem b'shar avodos. So he would put on clothing that were of lesser quality. He still has to wear the big day Kehuna because this is still avodah, right? But he would put on a lesser quality clothing. Now, why is that? Right, so he says, on the last line here, right? Because it's not mechubad, it's not honorable to wear the same clothing that you prepare the food in the kitchen that you do when you serve the king, right? When you serve the king, you have to wear special clothing. I forgot to put this down in the sources. I remember when I was learning this, I thought I had to connect it. In fact, I'm going to write it down so I don't forget next time. And excuse me one second, because I obviously forgot last time about this. But you remember the when it talks about when it rains on the first night of Sukkot, right? So it says when it rains on the first night of Sukkot. So there's what's the mashal that's given, right? It's like the servant that comes before Kadosh Baruch Hu, and it's as if the servant that comes before the king, and the king spits at the servant, right? The servant's coming to bring a meal, and the idea is, right, that it's a mishnah that we're coming to do a mitzvah for Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? And then Kadosh Baruch Hu spits us away with rain and tells us we can't fulfill the mitzvah, right? There's a certain idea of coming up before God, of service before God, right? So we say that that's tefillah. With tefillah, we're omed lifnei Hashem. Right, but what's the tefillah is avodah, right? What's the example par excellence of avodah? That's the actual avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. That's where we're standing before God. In order to stand up in front of God, the Cohen has to qualify to be the one to be able to do this. You can't just stand up before God. We have this in tefillah also, by the way. In tefillah, in order to qualify to stand up before God, you need a hikon. You need something that tells you, okay, I am now standing up before God. So that could be washing your hands, right, is one form of what's called hikon. Another form is you're supposed to wear special clothing when you stand in front of God in tefillah. You're not just supposed to walk in front of God. The Gemara talks about putting on a jacket, putting on some sort of special clothing that you wear for davening as a hikon, as a recognition of the fact that I'm standing before God. So there has to be some sort of qualification that allows me to stand before God. Okay, here, right, the Cohen literally has to be dressed for the occasion. That's the mitzvah here. There has to be begadim, right, big day Kehuna, that qualifies the Cohen to stand up and serve before God. Right, and that's how easy. You see this straight out with the Trumas Hadeshin. That's the whole idea here. The whole idea is that the Cohen has to be wearing special clothing to do the service in front of God. Okay, so, and that's the nature of this mitzvah, of the big day Kehuna, is that it qualifies, and keep in mind, it qualifies not the avodah, but it qualifies the Cohen to stand up before God. Okay, so therefore, what makes the avodah posul? It's not that there's something wrong with the korban. It's not like giving a korban with a blemish, right? But rather, the person giving the korban, right? That person is posul avodah. He doesn't count, and therefore, right? I'm showing you something here. It says like this. He says, "Bizman shebigdayim alayim kunasam alayim," right? Ain't kunasam alayim, ain't bigdayim alayim, ain't kunasam alayim, right? So he doesn't have his kahuna. He's not a Cohen when he's wearing the clothing. That's the idea. It's not enough that your father is a Cohen. And if you look here, the Rambam says, "Psula v'chayev misa bidei shemayim kizar shishime." She's just like an azar is someone who's not a Cohen. So the Cohen without the clothing is like a zar. He's just like me.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Oh, you can. Okay, great. Okay, probably my mic went dead. Okay, so the thank you. So okay, so the idea is right that the Cohen, okay, that the Cohen is like a czar. Again, he is a Cohen. He's still Cohen, but he doesn't qualify to serve. He's not qualified to serve inside the Beis Hamikdash and to do the avodah. Okay, and that's why his avodah is posul, because he himself isn't qualified to give it. So a czar can give a perfectly good korban, but the korban is still posul, right? Now, there's another problem, okay? That a czar that gives a korban, so that czar is chayev misa, because there's a penalty to going in front of God when you're not qualified, right? So therefore, so we would say, well, what's the problem? The guy's a Cohen. Oh, but he doesn't qualify as a Cohen without the begadim. He has to be dressed. The dressing is what qualifies him. Okay. So now we had a question, right? Why does the kavana of the Cohen really matter? Why does it matter if the Cohen is wearing special clothing or not, right? So and he has to be thinking to himself, I'm wearing this clothing because it's not to make me look good or even to make the Cohain look good. You know, it's like the Cohaim should look good, but rather the idea is that Kosh Baruch Hu decreed it, right? Why does that matter? Because it's so easy to lose track of what the clothing does. The halachic role of the clothing could be, right? One could think that what's the role of the clothing? The role of the clothing is to make the person l'chavod al sifaris, right? And therefore, halachically, that's what I have to keep in mind. But that's not what the clothing's purpose is. The clothing's purpose is as a qualifier. So therefore, right, what's the kavana when I put the clothing on? My kavana is I have to qualify to stand before God. This is the decree of God. When I stand before him, this is what I have to be thinking. So therefore, the kavana matters here. But again, it's not ma'akev, right? There's no halacha. The Rambam doesn't bring down in the Mishnah Torah that if the Cohen has the wrong kavana clothing, that he's then the avodah is posul, or for sure not that he's chayev misa, right? That we don't have. Okay. And now we understand this line that when the clothing is on him, so his Kehuna is on him. What does that mean, right? That means that he qualifies as a Cohen. Okay. So what's the conceptual connection now? Remember we saw the limud, the Gzera Shava and the Gemara between being drunk, your chayev misa, and when you're not wearing the clothing. So now it's very clear, right? What's the conceptual connection? It's about the qualification. A Cohen who's drunk, right, disqualifies himself from standing up before the king. You have to be sober when you stand up before God and do the avodah. So he disqualifies himself when he gets drunk, right? And then therefore he reverts to himself as a czar. The Cohen that doesn't wear the proper clothing is the exact same problem. He's disqualifying himself. A Cohen who disqualifies himself looks just like a czar, and just as the czar is chayav misa, so too anybody else any Cohen who puts himself as a czar, who disqualifies himself for standing before the avodah, has the same din. He's also now chayav misa. Okay. Then we had our last question, which is a second to last question. Sorry. Which is, what's the issue of having more clothing than required, right? Now that we have our svara, let's strengthen the question. If I have to have a certain amount of clothing and the right clothing in order to be qualified as a Cohen, I have the right clothing. I qualify. I'm a Cohen. I've got my four big day Kehuna on. It happens to be I have 5 because I put on an extra avnate. Okay, it was cold out, so I put an extra avnate on, right? So, okay, but so what's the problem? So I qualify. So why is it that I'm not qualified? So there's 2 ways of looking at it. Okay, so one way of looking at this is in order to qualify as a Cohen, I have to have the right amount of clothing on, right? Okay, I have the right amount of clothing on, but the second way of looking at it, and I think this is the correct way of looking at it, is in order to serve, I have to be properly dressed. Whether I have too little clothing or too many pieces of clothing on, I'm not properly dressed. When the Torah says you have to have the big day Kehuna, and it lists what the begadim are. Wearing those begadim makes me properly dressed and therefore qualifies me in the avodah. If I'm not properly dressed, which can be one of two ways, it can be I have too little clothing on or I have too many clothing on. Either way, I'm not properly dressed and I don't qualify as a Cohen. Okay, last thing. Okay, this I think is a cool idea. What's the difference between here we had in the in this last in the second to last source here we had the Ramban that brought up the Behag, right? What's the idea? Where the Behag looked at this and said the clothing is a hechsher avodah. It's what qualifies the avodah, right? And therefore, if you don't wear the clothing, the avodah is posul because the hechsher that needed to be done, the preparation in order to qualify the avodah, right, needed to be done. So now it should be obvious, right? The Behag is looking at it as a hechsher avodah. The Rambam is looking at the big day Kehuna not as hechsher avodah, but hechsher Kehuna, right? And therefore, since it's hechsher Kehuna, it's not getting the avodah ready; it's getting the Cohen ready. But that's not a hechsher. That is hainuach. That's the mitzvah for the Cohen to be ready, right? So it's not that it's doing. It's a preliminary step. There is no further step. The Cohen has to qualify himself, right? That's not a hechsher to something else, right? That is the qualification. That is a mitzvah in of itself for the Cohen to qualify himself for the avodah. That's not a hechsher. The Behag looked at this and said, what do you mean? This is just in order to get the avodah ready, right? Which is why the Behag wouldn't even contemplate the idea that if the Cohen wasn't ready, that he would be chayav misa, right? That wouldn't make any sense. There has to be a lav for that. So the Behag is forced by his position to create a losase, even though the Torah never says, don't thou shalt not serve without clothing on. But the Behag has to create a losase because the chi of misa exists. Right, that exists. That's a Gemara. The Behag can't deny that. So therefore, he has to go ahead and create the losase. The Rambam doesn't have a need for a prohibition because the Rambam isn't looking at this as a hechsher avodah, right? He's looking at this as hechsher Kehuna. And if the Cohen isn't qualified and he serves, then we already have that on the books that he's chayav misa. That's not so much of a chiddush anymore that we know. And where do we learn that? We see that with the Gzera Shava. So that's it. So the difference between the Behag, who looks at this as a hechsher avodah, and the Rambam, who considers this a mitzvah, because he doesn't see it as a hechsher avodah, but rather he sees this as what's koshering the Cohen. It's the hechsher ha-Cohen itself, and that itself is a mitzvah. And that is the mitzvah of big day Kehuna.
So would it be correct to say that the Rambam holds that these big day Kehuna are so essential to the identity of the Cohen that when he does the Aromas Hadeshin, he can't just wear the regular clothing, the regular big day Kehuna, and have an apron on top to protect the clothing. It has to be limited to the big day Kehuna, period. You can't put something else on top of it to even protect it.
Yeah, well, what's the Havamina to think that putting on something on top? It's not the reason why he puts on lesser clothing is not to protect the clothing. It's to show that the Trumas Hadeshin itself, right, the cleaning off of the Mizbeach itself, is not a form of avodah that's lifnei Hashem. It's a lower form of avodah. So therefore, it gets a lower form of clothing. It's not about protecting the nice clothing. It's about showing that the avodah of Trumas Hadeshin is not the avodah in front lifnei Hashem.
No, so I'm saying it is lifnei Hashem, and that's why he has to wear the big day Kehuna, even when he's doing Trumas Hadeshin. He can wear clothing that's been used 100 times.
So why should he wear lower? I say if it's lifnei Hashem, why is he wearing lesser clothing? That's the whole idea. He says Shiur bigdei chol el shiur pchusim min harishonim. Why? Lefish ain't derech eretz shimzol kos l'rabo. The God should be shalhem hakader l'rabo. Right? There's a difference. The Rambam is saying that the Trumas Hadeshin is not in front of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's the idea. I mean, we'll look at that more. I believe if we ever do Trumas Hadeshin together, we'll see the Trumas Hadeshin. We'll see how it's a sort of this lower form of avodah. It is avodah. It's just a lower form of avodah.
No, I can understand. And it even fits in very nicely with the share that you gave last week, 2 weeks ago, with the avodah being bracketed.
Right.
in the morning and in the
it sort of
afternoon.
contradicts it almost, but I mean, you have to see it, right? It will
Because
support it, yeah.
Trumas Hadeshen goes
Right.
before the avodah.
Right, exactly. Yes, 100%. Yeah. Okay, great.
Right,
Okay.
Rabbi, sorry, one question.
Yeah,
Does
sure.
the Rambam in his book of mitzvah, does he believe that not getting drunk would be a negative commandment?
He would, I have to look it up. I don't know for sure.
Because that would be a little problematic, right? If not getting drunk was a negative commandment, but the clothing was a positive commandment.
I can see why you think that.
Or the Xer
But there might be another factor to being inebriated. Because if there's another factor to it besides just not qualifying for the Kehuna, right? So then that would be, I mean, we'd have to say that. We'd have to say that there's another factor to the Isser, right? Because what you're asking is not on the Rambam. You're really asking on the posul. If the posul says, right, that you're not allowed to serve inebriated, as opposed to saying that that inebriation would disqualify the avodah, right? So then your question exists on the posul, really, or at least the Rambam's understanding of the posul.
Right. I'm saying if you're going to use Xer Shava to connect the two, it would be odd if one was a negative commandment and one wasn't.
I wonder. I'd have to see. It says, look at the Gemara's, the way the Gemara says, how do we know that? You're not allowed to drink. Right? Right, and therefore the Gemara says, how do you know that it's aser mechusa begadim? Because it doesn't say you shouldn't do it. It says we learn it from chuka. Yeah, we have to look at that a little more. But I definitely hear your question. When we look at it, when we get there, believe it, it could be like 15 years from now. When we look at it, I was looking at the pace that we're going now when we get to the Los essays. But yeah, I just hope I live this long. But we definitely have to ask that question. Okay. A good week, everybody. And believe it, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.